come to discussing the actual book on the typewriter. A short film which will put everything in context. It's just a 1.5, 2-minute film. Let's see that and then we'll take this forward. Could we have the film, please?
Mentally locating the keys and pressing them with a particular finger for which it has to work. That is a speciality of typewriter. Hello, I'm Ashok Abhyankar, proprietor of the Abhyankar Short and Typing Institute. We are running this institute for last 84 years and this is the 3rd generation going on. We have 45 machines and 250 students. You get a sound, you get a feel of touch to the keyboard, and you also get a bounce that machine that gives you. It's a pleasure. That pleasure, you can't get it on a keyboard.
I met Sachin, I met Gavaskar, I met Lata Mangeshkar. My father told me, Chandrakant, unless you try to do something what you have already mastered, you will never improve. Once boss told me to type intercom list. So instead of typing that list in the usual manner, I type in the form of telephone. And that clicked me. At that time, I thought, okay, I'll become artist through this medium. Before taking VRS, one day in advance, I met our chairman. And I told them, sir, I wanted to purchase the typewriter, but our administration department, they said, it is not possible to sell you typewriter. So he was chief guest for my farewell, Then he said, okay, we are allowing Chandrakant to purchase typewriter for 1 rupee. So they actually gifted me this typewriter. And that typewriter is Halda typewriter. And now it's a family member of mine in our house,
62 साली माझं लग्न झालं. त्याच्यानंतर माझा टायपरायटरशी संबंध आला. तो जन्मभरात मेहनतही खूप माझे मिस्टर करत होते. मी माझ्याकडनं होईल तेवढी त्यांना साथ देत होते. तर सुरुवातीला आम्ही सुद्धा थोडंसं सर्व्हिसिंग वगैरे सुरुवात करून मग हळूहळू सेल परचेस वगैरे करून धंद्याचं पाय रोवलं. खूप माणसं आम्हाला गिरायकं चांगली भेटली. त्याच्याकडे किती जण मिरजेचे, सांगलीचे, इचलकरंजीचे, जळगावचे, वलसाडचे असे बाहेरगावचे बरेच लोक आमच्याकडे येत असत. टायपरायटरचं म्हणजे कसे टाईप बार कधी सोडवून ठेवलेले असेल तर कधी ते धुवून ठेव म्हणून सांगायचे. कधी प्लेटिंगचे पार्ट काढलेले असायचे तुम्ही प्लेटिंगला नेऊन टाकायची, आणायची. पेंटिंगला मशीन द्यायचं असायचं. शिवण शिवत असे. मुलांचे अभ्यास मीच घ्यायची. सगळं घरात पण मीच करायचे. आलं गेलं मीच करायचे. हे कसं मी सगळं एवढं मॅनेज करू ते हा मला आता प्रश्न पडतो.
That's a marvelous little film that tells you a little bit about this machine. I see a lot of people here who would have personally used the typewriter in their professional and personal life, but also a lot of people who may actually wonder why are we talking about ancient technology which is no longer in use. Well, as a matter of fact, it is in use in a lot of places. We'll come to that. But a quick one-word introduction, a one-minute introduction on how this book came about. Godrej was the first and last manufacturer of the Indian typewriter. It was the first manufacturer of the Indian typewriter and the last manufacturer of the manual typewriter in the world. And a few years ago, when the last machine rolled out, and there was a lot of news coverage about that last machine rolling out, the idea came about that we should commemorate this in some way. And not commemorate it in the usual way of saying Godrej produced so many typewriters at a particular time, but commemorate it in understanding its social, cultural, historic value, and commemorate it in trying to understand what changes it brought about. It brought a lot of women into the workforce, and it empowered people who could then use the typewriter to earn money. You may have gone to the high courts and various courts in Bombay and seen people sitting outside. There's still some people sitting outside the post office, general post office, writing letters So it brought about changes. But most of all, there was also a lot of nostalgia. The machine had been around for a long time, decades, and it served people in all kinds of situations. Hemingway wrote on it, people carried it in wars, and people wrote poetry, novels, letters, correspondence. And so we set about collecting archival material. We had great photographs, old and new, and we had a group of writers associated with the book. And Brigid, who has been using a typewriter for many years, she's going to also talk to us about it. David, you have written a book on the everyday technologies of use in India, and the typewriter is one of them. Tell us how how your book came about, and what did you realize when you researched this?
Thanks. I suppose for me, as for many other
I think you may have to.
as for me, as for many other people of my generation, the typewriter has always been a very autobiographical machine, which may seem an odd thing to say because I suppose many people think of typewriters as being rather impersonal. But I was taught to type by my mother, who was a part-time typist, and as a junior academic, I spent an awful lot of time typing my own articles and book drafts and so on. And I should just remind you that doing typing in the old manual way was physical hard work. It wasn't as easy as using a computer these days. So I suppose I have a feeling of personal investment in the typewriter. But about 6 years ago, I started to do research for a book on what I call everyday technology, which has now been published a couple of years ago. But in that book, I was trying to get away from the idea that the history of technology is just a history of big machines, of railways, of irrigation systems, of electricity plants, and so on. And I wanted to create a more intimate, small-scale history of technology. So in my book, I look at sewing machines, at bicycles, at rice mills, and at typewriters. And it seemed to me that typewriters were a very under-investigated area of not just the technological history of India, but also the social and cultural history of India as well. And actually being in this building, in these studios, reminds me of a very famous Hindi film director in the 1950s, Guru Dutt, who made a number of films in these studios in the 1950s, including one called Mr. and Mrs. 55. And it's a remarkable film because in a sense, although it has a love story or two love stories running through it, it's kind of a hymn of praise to everyday technologies. People are constantly speaking to each other on the telephone, people are getting into cars, at the very end of the movie, somebody gets on an airplane. But central to the main part of the story is the typewriter. And there's a great scene in which the actor, Johnny Walker, plays the part of a photographer working for a newspaper in Bombay. And when his girlfriend, who is a typist, goes out of the office, he sits down at her chair and he types with one finger, "I love you," on the piece of paper in front. And when she comes back, she's both upset that he had spoilt her letter, but also delighted that he has declared his love through the typewriter. And then, of course, they sing and dance around the office until the rest of the office staff come back. But that, for me, was a wonderful encapsulation of the way in which, although for many people, typewriters might mean drudgery, boring office work, routine life in a very crowded and noisy space, and we shouldn't forget the typewriters were noisy, it captures something of the light-hearted possibilities of the typewriter, that people meet over the typewriter, that the typewriter travels, as it were, between different societies and different parts of societies. So although the typewriters that I write about are mainly typewriters coming from the United States and Britain, up until the 1940s, 1950s, they were mostly imported typewriters. Even so, they acquire a social life of their own in India. They become part of an Indian cultural scene. And they move in a very significant way from being European machines to being Indian machines, from being men's machines to being women's machines, from being something which is confined to the office to something which is very much a part of the household, of the political organization, the kind of social activities which people are developing in that period. So for me, the typewriter really encapsulated something dynamic in the way in which technologies, small technologies, but important technologies, inform our everyday lives.
Yeah, in fact, this is the book, by the way. I'm finding it very difficult to lift it with one hand. It's quite a handsome book. Your reference to that movie, it's interesting to know that in another film that the same company made, Johnny Walker comes to steal a typewriter from a newspaper office and witnesses a murder.
Yeah.
So the typewriter was making its appearance in popular culture by then. Brigid, you were telling me just before we entered that you were very much a typewriter person and now regret giving it away. Tell us about your own, you've written all your books on the typewriter, the earlier ones.
Yes. Is this working? Does that sound good? When I was asked to come to Mumbai and do this talk, my friend said, "What are you going to talk about?" And I said, "I've been asked to talk about typewriters." And they said, "Typewriters? How weird." But they didn't understand a typewriter. I learned to type when I was 16, and that was 61 years ago. And I went to a secretarial school, and we had to type the sentence, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," because that sentence has every letter in the alphabet in it. And ever since then, I've been devoted to my typewriter. I had an Olivetti portable, and I looked on it as a sort of war horse, a sort of brave piece of machinery which wasn't tethered to anything like a computer. You could carry it round, you could take it with you, you could drop it on the floor, and it was sort of always there. It was your friend. And I now think that typewriters are like dogs, sort of faithful, loyal, sturdy, and computers are like cats. I don't like cats, and I hate my computer. And the computer does things like, well, the other day, my daughter told me that she was feeling very depressed. She's called Claudia. So on the computer, I wrote her a note saying, I call her Fat Baby. I wrote, "Dear Fat Baby, don't worry about being depressed. I'll always be there for you, and you can crawl back into my tummy anytime you want." And then I pressed send and sent it by mistake to a very eminent cookery writer called Claudia Roden in Britain, whom I don't even know, but I interviewed her once, so she was on my computer. So she got this ludicrous email, and she sent me back an email saying, "I imagine this is for a daughter. I have daughters, so I understand." So that was very sweet. But at least my typewriter never went off on a limb and did things like that. But the shocking thing is that day before yesterday, I went to where there is the typewriter, which is the host of this talk.
Yes.
And I thought, oh, there's a typewriter machine that looks exactly like the thing I had on the newspaper. So I sat down in front of it to type, and I had forgotten in the 15 years since I used a typewriter that you have to use so much effort, and it's a really strenuous thing. And Agatha Christie once broke her wrist, and she couldn't type and had to dictate her novel to her sister who was typing it for her. And she said, "Dictating is not the way to go. You're far too loquacious and you talk too much. But if you actually have the stress of sitting at the machine, having to pound out the words, this is a very good editing process. You don't write more words than you've got the energy for." But there's just one last point, which is I worked on a newspaper for years, and the newsroom was full of cluttering typewriters, people on Bakelite phones, the whole sort of romance of newspapers.
And smoking.
Smoking, typing, smoking, typing, smoking, and this whole sort of noisy process. I just spoke to Tina Brown, the American journalist, before I came in here, and she said, yes, it's awful. Newsrooms have fallen silent, rather like journalism itself.
Yeah, that's very interesting. speaking, speaking of effort, speaking of effort, I think some of us tend to also bang on the laptops a little. Rama, you have written a wonderful piece in the book. I remember we had a lot of discussion about it, and you went around and interviewed people and all that. Tell us sorry. And you're a newspaper person, but you obviously use a computer, right?
Yes, but I also come from the generation where we began with the typewriter. So I was just being asked to type a little 4 or 5 lines outside in the booth, and I'm like, I just typed, I'm so glad it's 2016 and I don't have to deal with this machine anymore. And I understand how difficult, I'd forgotten what it was like. But yes, my chapter is about the feminizing of the workforce and how the coming of the typewriter and the female typist was a milestone in the women's movement, and it proved to be a catalyzing role for the shift of women into the public sphere, who until then were mostly teachers and nurses, the caregiving roles. For the first time, they came into office spaces as peers, and how the typewriter and the coming of the women typist set the stage for an enactment of gender anxieties. What it did to the men, the male workforce. They wrapped the image of a woman behind a typewriter in deeply sexual undertones. They stereotyped her. And the more I talked to people from that era, both men and women, the anxieties, the male anxieties mostly came out from a sense of resentment over the power that she wielded. She had the boss's ear. She had a fancy swirling chair. She sat right next to the cabin, whereas the male typists, we all sat in the common floor, open floor. When she had access to the officers' cafeteria, whereas we went to the staff cafeteria, we got tea in these glasses, teacups, and whereas she got it in a tray with a tea cozy and those kinds of things.
Secretary. That's
the boss's secretary. So there was a lot of anxiety about that, and how she did light work, but we got the donkey's work. There was a lot of resentment, and it's very strange because there was a lot of literature around that time, comic strips and cartoons, which sexualized the female typist as one who brought glamour to the office, where the male boss is looking at her thighs and saying, are you ready for the dictation? In fact, there was some in America where the boss's wife was beating the office secretary, the boss's secretary, the typist, yeah. And they were referred to as the office wives. And it's interesting, the sexual stereotypes and the sexualizing of the female typist, because when women entered the workforce as typists, the puritanical forces in the West were saying this machine will unsex the woman. And it will ruin family institutions. That's the kind of odds that she was up against. And even in India, in the 60s and the 70s, some of the women I spoke to who entered the workforce at that time, when they would return from work, many of the neighbors would look at her and say, do you work for the government or private sector? And they often said government, because that kind of made it safe, because one woman said, it appeared as if I'm not beholden to my boss for my job, and hence I wasn't compromising in any way. So there were all these narratives, social narratives, regressive narratives that she was battling against when she stepped out and went and did her job. Her parents had to send her out. Her parents had to send her to a typing institute. And I have a section about the typing institute and how, budding romance, and because that was one safe space that the parents sent their daughter to. And for 1 hour, she was unaccompanied by the father or the brother. And many young boys would write love letters instead of the quick brown fox.
Except that they couldn't email it. You had to write it and hand it over.
So the typing institutes were an avenue for safe romance, as it were. And then she goes on to become a typist, and many of them were earning members. Many women ran the typing institutes as well. And finally, in my chapter, I write about what the typist role was in a political party, and how many typists became gatekeepers, close confidants of important politicians, and then they became power brokers, and many of them, as we know, went on to become powerful politicians themselves. So, and it all began with this humble typewriter where they were writing acknowledgement letters and recommendations and things like that.
But I must tell you, I mean, you mentioned the sexualized secretary. Miss Fonseca, of course, is she is a cartoon character in many cartoons that Mario drew, and she's actually kind of smarter than she looks, but the image is that of this curvaceous skirt wearing. So there is a sense of also, if I may give the other side, there's also a sense of breaking away from traditional roles and becoming a little more modern in a sense. So that's because you are a secretary, you can go that far. An officer is not expected to go that far.
Right, right. And a lot of popular culture, even in India,
Yes,
you know,
yes,
movies, and
of
they're
course.
played on that. And in fact, the whole image of modernity for Indian women in the 50s and 60s and the 70s came with a lot of baggage too. You know, modernity wasn't something that women should embrace. You know, it came with the baggage of someone who had loose morals, someone who was having affairs in the office. So a lot of female typists had to battle with that stereotypes because when they went to watch a film and one lady said, I went to watch a movie and there was this figure of a female typist dropping her pallu and giggling and acting silly, and she says it was very difficult for me to deal with those kinds of narratives that were swirling around.
Yeah, but actually, Indira, you actually interviewed people and got their voices who had dealt and worked on the typewriter, right? So did you find these things?
I actually was talking to street typists, and
Okay.
most of them were, I mean, this particular group I had gone to interview were in Calcutta. They had, after years, I mean, in fact, I went into how they learned to type.
If you can tell us in one line what a street type is, because
A
I think
street typist, I mean, was more common when I was going to college. Many of our mark sheets, certificates, you had no Xerox machines, so they had to be typed out, and you needed someone to say authenticated true copy, and that was how you made copies of, you know, certificates and mark sheets. Street typists, basically you'd see them in street corners, sitting with their typewriters, sometimes on the street, as many of Chirdeep's photographs have shown even now. But sometimes they get a little table, a rickety table and a chair, and they would hire those machines and sit and type and get paid for
per sheet.
per job. As
Per
it was
job.
called. You got paid per job, and you had to give, if you had hired a machine, you also paid a certain percentage of what you earned to the person to whom the machine belonged. The group that I was talking to in Calcutta, in Hyderabad, they actually, many of them owned their machines. But they found, it was quite interesting because I do a lot of oral history. So I go and talk to people about their lives and what they have experienced. And it's interesting how the role memory plays in getting those memories from the past into the present. So it is something we do together in the present, but it is about the past. A lot of them were very, very bitter because many of these street typists never got jobs at all. Their aspiration, and the typewriter was a part of that aspiration, was to get a job, an office job. And one of them said, what is the use of recording my story? You know, life has passed me by and I've not got a job. I've gone without the security of a salary. So it just doesn't matter. You know, I remain this typist and my life has passed. And right now we are not quite relevant because everyone goes to the computer, agency. If you don't have a computer at home, you go to one of these places where you can get your applications typed on computer. A lot of these street typists now have started training those who will be computer typists. But that's not a lot.
That's just to learn the keying.
Just to learn the keyboard. And what struck me as interesting in the course of my conversation with I think there were about 10 of them, and I spoke to them at different points. I said, so what is it that's exciting? What is it that you do? And they said, we get very well paid on the days we are hired by a film producer or a television producer who's shooting a courtroom scene, and we are taken in cars into a studio, and we are typists. So it is the make-believe world that comes alive for them. I mean, it's almost as if in reality they have lost their relevance, and their relevance and indispensability of this tool, the typewriter, reasserts itself in this make-believe world when they are playing themselves, when they're playing typists. And it's interesting that I say this in the studio where perhaps many of these scenes were shown.
Yeah, we are sitting, in fact, I've always felt this is a really historic, and occasionally they should once in a while have sessions which talk about some of the wonderful, wonderful things that were shot here. David, we heard empowerment of women, but also a certain kind of resentment, pressure. We heard about this class, dying breed, but still somehow hanging on, of street typists. And we heard Brigid talk about her typewriter. Now, one of the things in India, you may have noticed, people didn't keep typewriters at home. Unlike laptops, it was never a home thing beyond a point, because no student grew up and got a typewriter as a gift. Got a cycle, perhaps a watch, but never a typewriter as a gift. What were the home roles of typewriters, did you find?
Well, I think this is actually quite an interesting question, because there were certainly some, let's say, upper middle class families which did have typewriters at home. And just to go back to the gender issue, there were certainly women activists who didn't have an office. They worked very much from their home, from their bedroom or sitting room, whatever. And certainly they used typewriters at home. So I don't think we should think of it as just being, out there in the office. And we shouldn't forget also that typewriters were on the street in India, and to some extent still are. So the physical locations in which typewriters operated are really very varied and significant. But to add one point to that, I find it very interesting that if you look at photographs of novelists and writers in the West, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, there is Ernest Hemingway with his typewriter. There is George Orwell with his typewriter. There is George Bernard Shaw with his typewriter. It's very much a part of the artist's identity as a writer to be seen with your typewriter. You don't find such pictures for India. There's no picture of Tagore with a typewriter. And one may even laugh at that suggestion. Tagore was one of those people who believed in the beauty of the script, of the Bengali script. And I think many writers felt that actually the creative process was something which was to be done by hand, not through this drudge machine of a typewriter. So I think that's quite an interesting difference as well. But if I can just move on to one further point, and that's the whole vernacularization of the typewriter. And although Swadeshi machines, Indian-made machines, didn't come into existence until the Godrej machines we're talking about here in the 1950s, there were vernacular typefaces being used on typewriters from the 1890s, 1900s in this country, with Devanagari characters in Marathi, in Hindi, Bengali, and so on. And one wonders what they were used for. I think many of them were used in Indian business houses. I think some of them were used in the princely states. A state like Kolhapur in Maharashtra had a secretary, a male secretary, whose responsibility it was to take dictation in Marathi and type in Marathi. So although, maybe it wasn't particularly conspicuous in the home, I think we should recognize these diverse kind of locations.
There's also a little bit of what I would call class differentiation.
Yes.
So the boss will not have a typewriter in his room. It's the secretary will have it, and the boss will think that it's the secretary's job to take my dictation. While today, many a boss might have a laptop on their tables and may want to do their confidential correspondence by themselves. So I think the typewriter was seen as the job of the typing pool, or the typist, or the secretary. Yeah, interesting.
There are, of course, stories about how some typists got their job simply through nepotism. They weren't particularly good typists, but they happened to be the boss's nephew who needed a job. But I don't know the truth of that.
Yes, sorry, Indira, quickly, you wanted to say something on that?
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, I just wanted to add, because David, when you spoke about how certain things were done by hand and certain things were typed, I think when I was setting up the archives of TIFR, and I looked through many of the letters of Homi Bhabha, it's quite clear that if he was writing to Nehru, whom he addressed as Bhai, he would never type Dear Bhai, or wouldn't let his secretary type that. So it was always Dear, then by hand he'd write Bhai, and the rest of the letter was typed. So, I think, it was interesting how what was reserved for handwriting was that intimate form of address.
Sorry, Brigid, you were saying.
I was only going to say that with reference to all these famous writers who were photographed with their typewriters, there's a museum in Los Angeles which is a collection of typewriters that belonged to John Lennon and Ernest Hemingway and so on. And my daughter said, oh, I don't think I'd ever go to a museum of typewriters. And I thought, oh, I would go to a museum of typewriters, because to see the machine that Ernest Hemingway wrote, The Old Man and the Sea, would be to me much more interesting than seeing Elizabeth Taylor's shoes or something. I mean, or equally interesting. But I also wanted to say something about the keyboard, because we're living through a revolution now. The old QWERTY keyboard, which we have in the English language on our computers as well. I've just read something which says they're inventing a new keyboard which is to be used by thumbs only, and it's called calc. And you have two keyboards on a tablet, and one is for each thumb, and they're just to be used by thumbs. And so we are producing a whole new generation of people who are going to have enormous flexible thumbs. Because thumbing, we used to do finger touch typing, and now it's thumb typing.
The QWERTY was invented because some of the keys the most popular keys were in the center, and many of these keys would go in and they shouldn't jam against each other. There is absolutely no reason to have a QWERTY keyboard, a practical reason on the computer. But we still have we still have the shift key, we still have a lot of things which are a hangover from the typewriter.
But
Rama?
soon maybe the calc keyboard.
Rama, you heard about the various kinds of uses of the machine. Actually, the street typist could we say, is a failed office typist. There were men also who were sitting in the typist pool. Were their stories somewhat different?
Essentially, they viewed themselves as bread earners, as someone who men's stories were mostly about, until the 50s and 60s, it was predominantly male in India, the typist work pool. Unlike the United States, where in 1910, 80% of typists were women. So they came late. When they entered in the 50s and 40s and 50s, many of them said this was a quick way of getting into the office. If you could not go to college, get a degree, and go for further studies, I know I can still feed my family through this. So they looked at themselves as wage earners and out there changing the workspace. They wanted to be in an office. Many of them said they could only wear half-sleeve shirts because their hands were full of carbon all the time. And they got chairs without armrests because that's how much they were doing. So when the women came, they resented. But for the men, it was a very prideful space because they, even without a college degree, they could be in the office space in powerful positions and as breadwinners. The thing changed for women, I wanted to add here, in the 80s and the 90s, many of the female typists were pushed to the front office, the reception, because they were also given the job of a receptionist telephone operator, the PABX system. Yeah. So, and they were typists. So many offices you went to in the 80s and until early 90s, not after that, the woman would be having, the reception would have a typewriter and the PABX machine, and she would also be receiving the visitors who come to the office. And obviously she was overworked. And rarely would you see a male typist in that position. So many of them felt they were on display as well because they were the first person that the visitor saw. But interestingly, the phone also became an instrument of power for many of these women because you had to keep the receptionist and the telephone operator in good humor when you had to make a personal call, when you had to receive a personal call in the office line in the 80s. So she played that very well. So her job kept changing over time. And there was a lady I interviewed who said, I'm not a typist, I'm a businesswoman, because she ran a typing institute. So she viewed herself as an entrepreneur for many years. So, the way the women also saw themselves and their roles changing. And over time, men understood that, and even until the 80s, I think they resented because they said women were not kept late. When it had to be overtime work, we were asked to stay back. So the resentment kind of continued, that whole gender anxiety continued till the 80s, which was surprising for me because there were so many women managers by then in the 80s and in leadership positions in India.
Let me tell you, I don't know about the resentment for the outsider. The lady behind that counter or the door leading to the boss's office was a very formidable image because I, as a journalist, had to go there and charm my way or bully my way or request my way or beg my way to get through this. So
that was the power she wielded.
So that was a definitely gatekeeper and all that. There is something called the Secretaries Association, and believe me, the bosses were, for a long time, I don't know where it stands today, but it used to get great sponsorships for their annual meeting because the bosses too were scared of them. So it cut two ways. I think we have another 2 or 3 minutes because there will be questions. But on a personal anecdote, like everybody else, I too had to learn typing when out of school during the summer months when everyone was sent off to learn ASDF, LKJH, etc. And like many other people I know, we completely failed in the typing class, completely, because the teaching method had not changed for 100 years. And then when I went as a journalist in my first newspaper job, the editor said, I presume you know how to type. And I had been to 2 classes by then, twice, and I said I don't. And he said, we have no use for you. Please go, learn typing, then come back. But I eventually learned it on the job. And now I see kids, as soon as they are put on a computer, within 3 days, they are just doing it fluently. I suppose the effort is some part of it, but it's just one of those natural skills people have begun to pick up. So, anybody to say anything interesting?
I'm sure we all have stories about the difficulties of typing, but when I was first in India back in the late 60s, I used to try to type the letters that I sent back home. And you'll remember those blue aerogram forms.
Aerograms.
And you could start typing very well at the top of the page, but of course by the time you got to the bottom of the page and you were trying to squeeze in the important information, there was nothing holding the aerogram in place. It was sort of slipping around all over the place. So my parents got some very strange letters.
I can remember doing cutting and pasting, which of course on a computer is very easy, but I used to do cutting and pasting on my manuscripts, physically cutting out the paragraphs and then sellotaping them in a different order. And I can remember producing manuscripts which were about 12 foot long, you know, all sellotaped together, and then you'd have to retype that on the typewriter.
Yeah, because there was no cut and paste or delete.
No, but I quite like that process.
You just crumple the paper and throw it away. Actually, I think that it helped me in my writing because I could keep it tight. Because nobody wanted to take the extra effort to write 2 more paragraphs.
There was a great whitener, the whitening
Tipex.
liquid. Yeah.
It's called Tipex.
Tipex.
I think there are a lot of people in this audience who are wondering what the fuss is about, by the way. And they're wondering why these people talking about a machine that's no longer with us. But if you go out, there is a stall where the typewriter is actually kept. You can try your hand on it. You can, of course, you can buy the book, but you can try your hand on it, and you can try and hammer it and see whether your wrists can take writing 3 or 4 pages continuously. So I think that particular generation didn't do too badly.
A lot of them also scratched it out, with the whitening liquid, but also with blade. Many of the places you...
Incidentally, all these products, the whitener, the carbon, the ribbon, all of them are still in supply, still being produced, still being used for a very simple reason. The typewriter is still used in a lot of businesses. It's not only just used by the street typist or in the courts, but it's also being used by a lot of military agencies who don't like to be linked to the internet for fear of being hacked. So a lot of typewriters are still in use. Now, where does the production come from? There is apparently one company which is still churning out a few manual portable typewriters somewhere, and there's a lot of reuse. So maybe it will come back.
We haven't talked about the electric typewriter, which was a real innovation. But my husband was a journalist, my husband was a diplomat, I'm sorry, I was a journalist. And he was always posted in the developing world. So you'd sit down, you'd suddenly have a brilliant idea for what you wanted to write. And you'd sit down at the electric typewriter and there would be a power cut for 8 hours. So it wasn't a good machine to take with you.
Well, that power cut does not affect the typewriter, that's for sure. Sorry, Indira?
No, I just wanted to mention that I had interviewed people who had worked for Remington as well as Halda. And it was very interesting to listen to those stories of how the typewriter was manufactured, you know. What were the levels of skills that you needed the workers to learn, and how, for the Remington, a lot of the typefaces were produced in Germany. And I think the other day when I was listening to, you know, what you'd done with Godrej, gone and found out where these were produced, so you began to see the kind of achievement one company has where it starts making these typefaces.
Well, it's not a low-tech product because there are about 1,800 to 2,000 parts that go into it. There's a lot of precision engineering. As we heard that day, the rubber has to be of a particular kind because if the key hits it and the paper tears, then there is no use. The fonts have to be absolutely perfectly designed. Incidentally, the fonts are now designed or were designed in India, in Allahabad. So it's a pretty high-tech product. Anyway, any questions? Yes, please. Can we hear you?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, my question holds to each and one of you. How would you feel if a fan or an admirer writes you a fan letter from a typewriter? How would you react to it?
I would be absolutely thrilled. But that leads on to the thing about detective stories, because think of how many detectives found the murderer or the crook by looking at the typeface on the typewriter. And of course you can't do that anymore. But I would recognize the typewritten letter and I would fall in love with the fan.
anyone else gets fan letters that they...
I don't get any fan letters anyway. But I think, we were talking about this earlier really, that, that there used to be an idea that things which were personal and emotional should not be typed. And what Indira was saying about, writing the name of the person you were addressing, that was the convention. It was a way of making the letter more personal than having it typed all the way through, just as a signature, it suggested you were there. But just go back to this point about detective stories and keys. There was a famous case here in Bombay in the 1890s of somebody who was sending obscene postcards to the Viceroy and I think probably to the august King Emperor and to all kinds of people using a typewriter. And I'm afraid I've never seen these obscene postcards. I've looked very hard, but I haven't found them. But of course the clue to this anonymous typist was that one of the keys was defective. And eventually somebody in the post office here in Bombay was able to check who was producing these postcards, and there was a famous case. Actually, it was a Parsi who then committed suicide because he was exposed through this defective letter. So there's a whole series of stories, not just in detective stories, but in real life, about the way in which the typewriter is incriminated in crime, but also helps to solve crime.
Yes, please.
I've got the mic. So I have a wonderful anecdote, and then I'm going to ask you a question. I'd love to hear your reaction to the Mad Men series, because I mean, that's just so typical of, the women using typewriters. But my father-in-law was a civil servant, and he used to write to my husband these properly typed letters, and where the dear was typed out, and then he'd write my husband's name in there. And it used to drive my husband insane all through his 20s that his father would send him a typewritten letter. Always it was, affectionately yours was always handwritten, Daddy, but otherwise everything else was typed on that letter.
I suppose it's considered a little impersonal or alienating even, in a sense. Anyone reacting to Mad Men, the series?
I wanted to address both the questions. If someone wrote a typed letter from the typewriter to me, I would be a little scared. And I would also be a little fascinated that this person is very old world. But I would be scared because I'd be like, okay, he or she could have emailed me, but maybe they don't want to be traced, maybe they don't want that. So, I would be a little scared. I'd probably, if I meet the person, I'd take someone along. And,
like a ransom note, are you suggesting that?
No, because as we know, I mean, many of the murder mysteries in the movies, they always send these, after kidnapping the person, they will send a typewritten letter. But Mad Men series, yes, when I was watching Mad Men, it was, it reminded me of many of the interviews I had done for this book at that time, because, those very gendered workspaces and what the whole power that they wield behind the typewriter, the confidential information that they had access to, all that, and also how the male bosses were viewing them. It all came, alive for me when I was watching the Mad Men series. It's one of my favorite series.
Yeah, there's somebody there.
Hello, I'm Dr. Abhidha Dhumatkar, Head Department of History, Sadhaiye College. I have researched on the growth of science in Maharashtra from 1880 to 1947. I have got a question to Dr. David Arnold. You have talked about invention of typewriter. Was any Indian inventor associated in the history of growth of typewriter? I mean, in the first decades of 20th century, was there any Indian who was researching, and did he develop any aspect of typewriter?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I mentioned earlier the fact that American and British companies, but certainly Remington, the American company, went to the trouble of producing Devanagari typewriters and then in various other Indian scripts. And certainly at the time of the Swadeshi movement, in 1905 and thereabouts, there was talk about the possibility of replacing these foreign machines with an Indian-made machine. But the whole technology typewriter was much too complicated for Indian production at that time. And one of the factors there was that what the British had encouraged in this country was large-scale structural engineering, technology on a grand scale. And there didn't really exist the machinery or the expertise for the kind of fine, sophisticated, precision engineering which a typewriter required. And it's not just a question of typewriters, the same problem was encountered with sewing machines, bicycles. All of these technologies were actually much more complicated than India had the capacity to produce at that time. So the ideology was there, and certainly with some of these machines, like bicycles, there were stages towards the production of an Indian machine over the course of that period in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. But typewriters were peculiarly complex for the reasons that Siddharth was referring to earlier. And at the time of the Second World War, for example, it was extremely difficult for India to get the kind of specialized alloys, the rubber, the other essential elements which would make a typewriter. So it was only really after 1947, with the change of the political regime, with the opening up of Indian industry and so on, and the entrepreneurship of Godrej, I have to say, that it was possible for an Indian typewriter to come into production. So my answer is that the desire was there, but the actuality could only be realized 50 years after the creation of a Devanagari typeface.
No, in fact, Dr. Abhyankar, if you pick up this book, there is a long chapter on the struggles that Godrej went through. I'm sorry, I can't see her. But the struggles that Godrej went through to perfect that technology, and that could only happen because by then, materials were available, skills were available. But even then, it was a long struggle to get the precision right, and it required a company at a particular stage of development and a particular kind of push and passion to say we are going to produce it. So around the turn of the century, it would have been that much more difficult. Yes, sorry.
Yes.
Have you got that?
I'm here with my father, Dr. Indira Chowdhury, and he is a management consultant, writer, and author. And that many years ago, he would carry his portable typewriter just like people do with their laptops. And as a child, I remember receiving typed letters whenever he was traveling. But I do think that at the time when computers came in, he was probably in his early 70s or late 60s, but the transition from the typewriter to the computer became so much easier than his counterparts who did not have the typing skills, because as you rightly said, it wasn't part of every house. And I still remember Mr. Madhav Kamath, one day when he called, he said, "Usha, my world has come crashing down. My typewriter doesn't work. Do you have a typewriter?" And this was about 5-6 years ago. He could just not transfer on to a computer. And he was one of those who was familiar with journalism and everything, but it wasn't so easy for him to move to the computer. I just thought I would share these thoughts with you.
Thank you. Yes. Anwar has written a wonderful chapter in this. Anwar?
One particular brand of typewriter that I've been thinking of over the past few days was the Olivetti.
Yes.
Because it was such a great statement of 1960s Italian design. Do any of you have any experience or anecdotes about the Olivetti?
So I had an Olivetti actually,
I had an Olivetti.
which a friend who had got it from a smuggler passed on to me. But there were no spare parts available, so I had to get rid of it. Sorry, go ahead.
I had an Olivetti portable. I think it's in the garage now. I think I better get it out.
But beautifully
Probably
designed.
worth a fortune.
Like all Italian designs, it's beautifully designed.
It's in the museums in Italy as a great piece of design.
But tell me, how functional was it? I'll tell you why I ask. There were a couple of sort of veteran typists I knew, including an ex-boss of mine, who had bought himself an Olivetti as a statement. and never actually used it because he was very disappointed with it. Was there
No,
anything
I
to
wasn't
that?
disappointed with mine. I loved mine. It worked perfectly.
Okay. Busy Bee was one of those.
Yes.
He ditched his Olivetti.
So I met Ruskin Bond, and Ruskin Bond in his entire life has used only 2 typewriters. And I think one of them he had bought in England, so it must have been, an Underwood or one of those. But I think he had an Olivetti. And he has never typed on a computer in his life. He's written all those books on a typewriter.
And just one comment about famous authors' typewriters. Ian Fleming, as you probably know, had a solid gold typewriter that he bought. It's in the Fleming Museum.
So this is actually a hint, in case you didn't realize, that we have overrun our time. He's here to gently nudge us off, just half a minute. Again, as I said, please go outside, use the typewriter, bang it. It will not, you will have to bang it, so you're not doing anything unusual. And there's paper, there's everything. And the book is out there with great truth and regard. And I think at the very least, go through it, and then perhaps if you want to buy it and get it signed. Thank you.